Hello, this is Ashley Chapin, and I would like to start this presentation, The Data Action Model, by briefly introducing myself and its agenda. I am an elementary instrumental music teacher for students in grade 4 through 6 at 3 Prince George's County Public Schools. The age range for students in my classroom is 9 to 12 years old. The agenda for this presentation is as follows. I will start with an overview of the Data Action Model, followed by my experience with it. I will then share feedback that I've received and revisions I've made to my own data action plan, and finally, insights gained from the process. Let's start with the overview. The Data Action Model is a way of approaching data. It was created by Daniel R. Venables, and a complete description can be found within this book, How Teachers Can Turn Data into Action. The Data Action Model is comprised of 5 one-hour meetings with a 4-week action plan implementation period mixed in. The entire process spans roughly 9 weeks or 1 grading period. Materials that I share during this presentation are based on information that I found within this book. The Data Action Model can be broken into 3 phases. The first is to gather and review data. Data Meeting 1 asks the PLC to present existing baseline data, which is explored via the Notice and Wonder protocol. Members sit down with the data and are asked to notice factual things in that data and then to wonder why, if, whether, how they got there. The Notice and Wonder statements are turned into an overarching exploratory question that can, as Venables explains, reveal useful information and point in the direction of identifying learning gaps. Data Meeting 2 explores additional data related to the exploratory question. Prior to Data Meeting 2, the PLC collects other data reports as well as teacher and student work that can help shed light on the apparent gap. During Data Meeting 2, the PLC places this additional data into an artifact tracking sheet in order to label each as evidence of a learning gap or instructional gap and to indicate the significance and prominence of those gaps among students. Once this triangulation is complete, the PLC should have a better understanding of how instruction connects to student performance. The second phase asks the PLC to further identify gaps and plan for action. Data Meeting 3 helps the PLC determine gaps and establish a target learning goal for students. In the book, Venables expresses that this SMART goal represents, quote, the level of success the PLC would like their students to achieve and by when. The selected evaluation metric, or student assessment, will be used to determine whether the goal has been met or not. Prior to the 4th meeting, the PLC will perform a strategy search to locate new ways to teach the standard associated with the observed learning gaps. These new strategies, activities, or lessons should help the PLC present material in a different way in order to improve instruction and student success. Some of these strategies and activities will ultimately appear on the Data Action Plan tracking sheet. During Data Meeting 4, the PLC will employ the planning protocol to review and decide among the many located which strategies and activities are worthwhile to include in the action plan. Between the 4th and 5th meeting is the implementation period for the action plan. This should last roughly a month. The third and final phase is to evaluate and determine next steps. Once the PLC has completed the implementation of the data action plan, it is time to come back together for Data Meeting 5 and determine to what extent the students met the targeted learning goal and what to do next. Now, let's take a look at my experience with the Data Action Model. My PLC consisted of Judy, an elementary vocal general music teacher, and myself. The macro data that I presented was comprised of scores from a D major scale performance pretest. I administered this pretest to 34 beginning orchestra students in mid-September after only 3 weeks of instruction, or 6 lessons. Here is a sample from my demographic spreadsheet. As you can see from the blue and green highlights around the totals, I noticed a high number of female students as well as a high number of 4th graders. Here is a sample from my pretest score spreadsheet. As you can see from the red highlights, students were scored in 5 areas worth 4 points each for a total raw score of 20 points. The next series of highlights will show the things that I noticed of importance about this spreadsheet. The green highlight shows that all students failed the pretest with scores of 25 and 30%. The purple highlight illustrates that a score of all ones yields a raw score of 5 or 25%. A score of 1 equates to an area being undeveloped. This pink highlight indicates that a score with a 2 mixed in pushes the total up to a 6 out of 20 or 30%. Students that received 30% did so as a result of earning 2 points in rhythmic accuracy. These notice statements I've described turned into wonders, which led to this exploratory question. What precisely are the students having difficulty on regarding reading pitches and rhythms on the music staff, and how am I currently teaching those skills? After data meeting 1, I spent time amassing additional data for data meeting 2 that I would need in order to answer my exploratory question. I collected a series of teacher artifacts, which include the D major scale pretest, the vocal general music curriculum, the pacing guide for first-year orchestra, and a teacher calendar, as well as student artifacts, a corrected rhythm and pitch quiz, as well as a student warm-up reflection journal, all in an effort to make connections between my instruction and the student's performance in relation to reading, rhythm, and pitch. Data meeting 2 was ultimately dedicated to organizing this additional data into an artifact tracking sheet and presenting it to my PLC. The artifact tracking sheet here helped me to record by name the additional data that I collected, realize the relevant learning and instructional gaps in my classroom, and understand their significance and prominence. In data meeting 3, I spent time aligning learning gaps to instructional gaps they connected to using the table you see here. This small sample of my full table illustrates the joining of gaps in pink, the listing of resources found through research to combat them in green, and a listing of implementation tips based on the resources in purple. I used this second table to set a SMART target learning goal with accompanying evaluation metric for students. Instruction will focus on rhythm and pitch reading to help students achieve the SMART target learning goal of, by the end of December, 80% of beginning orchestra students will be able to read simple rhythms and at least the first 5 notes of the D major scale, with quizzes 2 times per month as an evaluation metric. Data meeting 4 required me to finalize my strategy search and plan for action using the data action plan tracking sheet. On it, I recorded an array of the most meaningful instructional tactics and methods to teach rhythm and pitch reading. Here is a sample of mine. I chose to focus on instructional tactics that held a combination of group and independent work activities, methods and verifying artifacts being quizzes or worksheets that support instruction and check for understanding at a typical frequency of weekly to bi-weekly. Data meeting 5 is intended to occur after the data action plan has been implemented for about a month. However, due to course time constraints, there was no time to implement the data action plan I created. Thus, for the purposes of this course, our version of Data Meeting 5 served as a time for peer review in an effort to evaluate the overall quality of our data action plans. My partner for Data Meeting 5 was Simone, a high school French teacher. Below is a summary of Simone's feedback received. Simone found that my implementation plans are realistic, viable, and valuable. She did challenge me to think about my evaluation metric in relation to the SMART goal. She found that teaching and learning will definitely improve after the data plan has been implemented. She did have the following suggestions for improvement: create homework incentives, incorporate technology tools like Kahoot to collect formative data, and try using Google Classroom to share information with students at home. Revisions made to my data action plan as a result of Simone's feedback. The redevelopment of my implementation timeline with attention to the post-test window. I will change my time frame to mid-January to allow time for me to teach the remaining notes in the D major scale to allow students to succeed on the final post-test in mid-February. Update the evaluation metric being used. I will continue to include the biweekly written rhythm pitch quizzes as a formative assessment, but I will also add a final rhythm and pitch quiz as a summative. Finally, I will be adding an additional technology component for students to access at home as homework or just for fun. This will go on my instrumental music classroom website. Insights gained from the process. An area of strength I've contributed to my data action plan is a fairly positive outlook and an open mind throughout. I learned early on in this course that it is important to remind yourself regularly that the data action model is a lengthy process and to be patient with it and yourself along the way. An area of further growth for me would be continued development of data literacy and particularly making myself collect more data. My classroom holds many opportunities for formative assessment, and I usually collect this through observation and taking of mental notes due to time constraints. However, I have come to understand through the data action model that these observations are just one type of formative data and ultimately not enough to build a case for the learning and instructional gaps that I observe in my classroom. I need to do a better job of collecting a variety of assessments, summative too, so that I can notice and wonder more things that I need to challenge and change in my classroom. One of the most rewarding aspects of completing my data action plan was the amount of reflection, personal and regarding my students, that I was required to do because it highlights just how important this process is. More often than not, I don't have or don't give myself time to just sit down, to notice and wonder, and truly consider what is really going on in my classroom, especially since I teach at 3 schools. The copious amounts of reflecting during each meeting sometimes felt daunting. However, in the end, the payoff is so glaringly obvious that I appreciate tenfold the opportunities I have been afforded to reconsider events, thoughts, and feelings from a fresh perspective throughout the data action meeting model process. Here is the list of references that I used for this presentation. And finally, thank you for watching.